Welcome to church. So good to have you this morning. World War II was one of the darkest, grim moments of not only the 20th century, but history in general. At the end of World War II, most of Europe was flattened and was in destruction, along with parts of Asia and Africa. Cities completely destroyed, roadworks gone, bridges decimated. On top of that, at the end of the World War II, there were shortage of fuel, food, basic consumer goods were hard to find. Inflation was on a rise. Sound like a familiar time. And there was all these realities that were happening that this war cost more than any other war up to that point. And combined, all the wars combined up to that point, World War II was more expensive than that. So economies were in disarray. People didn't know where the land borders were. It was a total mess. And as the dust settled from World War II, we began to hear about some of the atrocities and the horror that came out of that war as well. And not to mention the staggering amount of civilian and military deaths throughout that war, that the numbers were never even quite accurate because no one was even quite sure how many people died at that time period. It was a grim moment in history. Winston Churchill was one of the prominent figures in World War II, and he became Prime Minister of Britain at a time that Britain wanted to surrender. They wanted to give up. They didn't want to keep on fighting. Nazi Germany was on the rise, was taking over most of Europe, and the environment and the appetite for Britain at that time was like, let's just surrender. That's our best option. Winston Churchill knew this would be a huge mistake, and he almost single-handedly convinced the entire nation to fight, and boy, did they fight. They received and they experienced massive casualties and hard times, and that expression, that tough upper lip, kind of came out of that season of Britain fighting. Ultimately, the choice for Britain to fight brought in the Allies and had a place that they took on and ultimately won the World War II. But Winston Churchill, about a year or two before the war was over, knew that these atrocities, this horror, this dysfunction, these nations that have warred and killed one another for years, now he knew that at some point the war would end and there would have to be a rebuilding stage. And Winston, who was intimately involved with the details, knew about the reality of how challenging this was, and he was commented of saying, just about a year before the war was over, his solution to how to rebuild not only Europe, but the world as a whole. This is what he says, Churchill, about a year before the war was over: "We could find nothing better. There's no better solution, in other words, than Christian ethics on which to build, and the more closely we followed the Sermon on the Mount, the more likely we were to succeed in our endeavors." Churchill says, the atrocities of World War II and the massive dysfunction and horror it created, the only way that we can move forward as a society, nevertheless as humanity, is we go back to the ancient teachings of Jesus. And he says the closer we go to actually following the Sermon on the Mount, the more likely we are to succeed in our endeavors. See, it's Jesus' teaching that has had the greatest lasting impact. Whether you like it or not, the collective values of our society and the framework that we live, especially here in North America, in the West, is all built around the ethics of Jesus and the Christian tradition, and specifically the Sermon on the Mount, which you can find in Matthew 5-7. If you've never read it, you should read it. It's take you about 15 minutes. Dallas Willard, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, speaking about this, he says this: "What Jesus had to say about human good and evil was of sufficient depth, power, and justification to dominate European culture and its offshoots for 2 millennia." In other words, Dallas is saying is we have not discovered anything better than the teachings of Jesus. There has been nothing better that has helped us as a society to move forward. And the reason why is because the Sermon on the Mount has such depth, power, and justification to it. Even Richard Dawkins, the prolific atheist who, in his book, The God Delusion, spends most of the book spitting and just getting all upset and criticizing Christianity and his disgust for the Bible and ridicule of faith. And he goes on and on and on. But his tone changes when he gets to the topic of Jesus. This is what he says in his book. Indeed, Jesus, if he existed, and by the way, a few weeks ago we talked about how every respectable historian believes that Jesus did existed. But anyways, he goes on, he says, and Jesus, if he existed, was surely one of the great ethical innovators of history. He goes on, he says, the Sermon on the Mount is way ahead of its time. Almost as if it was of a divine nature. But even Hawkins, or Richard Dawkins, is looking at Jesus and says, listen, the teachings of Jesus are just unparalleled in their significance in shaping society and humanity. We're in this series all about a Spectator's look at Jesus, and we're looking at the different aspects of Jesus. And you guessed it, today we're looking at Jesus as teacher. Probably what he's most well known for. See, if I went around the room and I asked you to give an adjective or a title for Jesus, some of you might say Son of God, some of you might say Messiah, friend, some of you might say charismatic leader, some of you might say revolutionary, some of you might say things around that, some of you might, I'm not sure. But if I asked a Jew in the first century who was sitting at the synagogue or was at the market and they saw Jesus and they interacted with Jesus, the term that they would most commonly use and what they would see him as would be a teacher. Specifically, the Aramaic word of that is a rabbi. In fact, this seems to be the title that Jesus is most called in throughout the Gospels. John repeatedly calls him a rabbi. Luke calls him a teacher because he's mostly speaking to a non-Jewish audience and the word rabbi wouldn't make sense. But most of the biographers of Jesus' life, the way they describe him and the term they use is teacher or rabbi. Jesus himself seems the most accepting of that term. And he allows individuals to call him teacher and rabbi. So it's this term around Jesus being a teacher and a rabbi that I think will help us with our conversation today. And this is where we're just going to camp for a bit and we'll move on from there. Jesus as rabbi. There's many different places in Scripture that speak about this in the biographies of Jesus, but we're going to just look at one in Mark chapter 2, verses 13. It'll be up in the screen. We've already looked at this text. If you've been with us for a series, we looked at this text at the person of Levi and the attraction of Jesus and how Jesus attracted those that were on the outskirts, those that were unlikely. That's the story again. But we're going to look at the first two verses of that passage because in that helps us see Jesus as a rabbi and the specific relationship that he has with those around him. This is what it says in Mark chapter 2, verses 13. Once again, in other words, Mark's saying, this was the normal rhythm of Jesus. This was the common behavior of him. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to, what? Teach him. Here we see him playing into the role that was most described to him. He began to teach him. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. This is the guy that would never be associated with any rabbi, but Jesus looks at him and gives him the command, follow me, Jesus told him. And Levi got up and followed him. I could go on and describe and read many different passages where Jesus functioned as a rabbi in the first century, but I just want to take a moment to give you some context to understand the significance of what Jesus is doing. See, at this time in Judaism, there was different sections of Judaism. And we would have what's the Sadducees, and the Sadducees were the ones that were connected with the people in the know. The Sadducees ran the temple. They were connected with the political and cultural elites. They were the ones who had the money. They were the ones who ran things. And naturally, when you have a form of your religious authority that seems to be too close to the Roman Empire, too cushy with those that are in power, the common day individual seems a bit of a disconnect in that. So out of that came the sect called the Pharisees. If you've ever read the Gospels, you hear lots about them. And the Pharisees were the type of Jews that would want to be among the people. In other words, they weren't in the temple, they weren't in the places of elites, they were among the people. They were at the synagogues, but they were at the markets. They were at your workplace. You'd see them on the street. They were among the people. And these Pharisees would be ones that would interpret the Torah. They would give you understanding of what the Torah means. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible and your Old Testament. So the Pharisees were these individuals that would go and give interpretations of the Torah, and they would have amongst them what was known as rabbis. Rabbis were specific teachers. And in the first century, everybody would associate with a different rabbi. If you were a good Jew, you would want to try to associate with the rabbi that you wanted to choose. And rabbis they differed in what they believed about what the Torah meant for the modern day of that time. So Jesus, although had no formal training, functioned in this role, which is interesting, by the way, because we get frustrated with the Pharisees, but Jesus was probably the closest sect of Judaism he was closest to was the Pharisees, because he was a rabbi amongst the people, which might be why he was so critical of his peers. And it might explain why the Pharisees were so frustrated with him. It wasn't just that Jesus was just some radical guy. He was supposed to be a rabbi, and there was a great expectation of what rabbis looked like, and Jesus violated this. Jesus did things that didn't make sense, and they were frustrated because Jesus should know better. In fact, in many times, even in the story, if you keep reading, the Pharisees come in and say, "What's the rabbi doing eating with these people?" In other words, there's this manner, there's this method, there's this reality that rabbis should be living that you're not living. So Jesus, for all intents and purposes, functioned in the rabbi terms, but there's a couple things that were different about him. The first one was his authority. See, rabbis at this time, they would simply convey and refine knowledge. They would just give their interpretations of what the Torah means. So they read the Torah, and then they would tell you what that means for you making soup that day. They'd get that specific. They would tell you about what you should do on Sabbath. They should tell you how to live, what you should do with your mind. They would just interpret the Torah and explain it to you in that day. Their authority always came from the Torah, though. But Jesus didn't always look to the Torah. He said bold things like I statements. Jesus didn't say, hey, the Torah says this. This is what the word, he says, I say to you. He even, in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, listen, I know you've heard it say, and then he would quote the Torah. Then he'd say, but I say to you. In other words, he would create a further revelation. He would extend on what the knowledge was, and he would put authority in himself, not simply the Torah. You can understand why the Pharisees would get frustrated and upset about this. So his authority was different, and secondly, his invitation was different. See, at this time, a good Jew would want to be associated with a certain rabbi. And so if to be a rabbi of prominence, you would go through this extenuous application process. And your life and the different things in your knowledge, it all would be about trying to be applying to be affiliated to learn under a certain rabbi. And so the way that you became a disciple is what it's called, or a pupil or a learner of a certain rabbi, is you applied. But if you read through the story of Jesus, he never did this. See, Jesus didn't simply read through applications and approve them. He extended invitations. He extended an invitation to a guy like Levi, a tax collector who would have no right being associated with any rabbi. He extends an invitation to him. To give you an example, those of you that graduated from high school recently, this would be closer to your memory. It's getting further and further from my memory. But when you graduate, everyone's like, what's next for you? You know that question? They start asking you grade 10 and you're like 14. You don't even know that there's life after high school. Anyways, they start asking, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? It's a very intimidating question, right? And so, you start thinking about it, and people are like, where are you going to school, and whatever. And some of you might take a gap year and take a year off. So let's say you don't know what you want to do with your life, like myself when I graduated, and you take a gap year, or you do something else, you work, and you don't go to a post-secondary right away, or you might never get there. But imagine the best university in the country, one with a lot of prominence, one where your GPA would never meet the standards for that. They sent you a letter giving you a full ride and inviting you into the program, but you never even applied. That would be shocking, right? That's what Jesus did with his disciples. He gave them an invitation where their merit was never deserving of one. They would never be able to associate with such a rabbi that was very popular at the time. Jesus, huge crowds were gathered around him. This was the rabbi to be with, and Jesus didn't take applications. He gave extended invitations. See, a rabbi would have a group of individuals around them. We now know them as the 12 disciples, but Jesus had more than just the 12. Those were the closest to him. He had large crowds around them. And these people that would be around them were disciples. They were followers of Jesus. See, rabbis, how they taught was not in this setting. So you all come in from your different environments. You sit here for about 2 hours as I talk. Kidding. But you sit here for a bit, and then you listen, and then you go your separate ways. But in the ancient world, how a rabbi would talk, it'd be like, hey, I'm going actually for lunch. Come with me. Okay, now I'm going to go help this farmer. Hey, come. And along the way, they would teach, and then they would sleep in a field, and you'd sleep in that field, and they would go to one city, and you go with them. The rabbis taught by their life, and you would follow them. So when you hear about a large crowd followed Jesus, that was quite common with rabbis. See, to be a follower of Jesus in the ancient world would be to simply do the things that Jesus did. So I think I've laid enough foundation about Jesus as a rabbi and the type of relationships he would have with his disciples and how he functioned in that. So mostly through this series, we've looked at different aspects of Jesus, different characteristics of Jesus. But today, we're going to look at how do we relate to Jesus. In other words, we're going to have the DTR conversation. Do you know what DTR stands for? Define the relationship. Now, I've been out of the dating game for a while, a long time. But back in the day, I don't know if you still do this, but we would have something called the DTR conversation. So you're, with a girl or a guy, and the relationship's going, and at some point, I would say, we need to define this relationship. In other words, where are we going? I like you. Do you like me? Is this mutual? I don't like you. I'm sorry if I've given you the wrong impression, right? At some point, you need to define the relationship. Gentlemen, ladies find this very helpful if you help them out at some point. So you just not, bringing them along. At some point, you need to define the relationship. And not just in a romantic sense, but in any type of relationships. In working relationships, it's very helpful to define the relationship. Okay, how will we operate together? What will be the boundaries? What will this relationship look like? What are the expectations? Where are we going? Every healthy relationship, at some point, you need to define what it looks like. Today, we're going to have that conversation. We're going to define what the relationship with Jesus looks like. And how we're going to have that conversation is we're looking at how Jesus was a rabbi and then how his disciples related to him. Because in this ancient relationship of disciples and rabbis, it gives us a clue, it gives us some pointers of how we today can be followers and disciples of Jesus and how we relate to him today, even though he might not be here standing with us and we're not sitting out in the rain around a campfire. How do we relate to Jesus? So the remainder of our time, that's what we're going to talk about. So 2 implications of being a disciple. 2 implications of being a disciple. Number 1, it sets your direction. Being a disciple to Jesus or to the rabbi, it sets your direction. How do you become the person you want to be? How do you become the person you want to be? How do you become that type of father or mother or friend or colleague or brother or sister? How do you become that type of person? Well, Tyler Staton talks about how the person you become will not be based on your best intentions, your willpower, your discipline, or even your circumstances. He says it will be based on who your rabbi is. In other words, we all have a rabbi. Now, this is an ancient word, and maybe you never thought about having a rabbi before, and this sounds foreign for you, but we all have someone that we set our direction to, something we're modeling after, something that we're following its leading, something that's pointing the direction for us. And maybe that's our spouse, our kids, the type of family we want. Maybe it's our wealth, our career, our image. Maybe it's about a goal that you have in your life. But we all have a rabbi that we're shooting our direction to, that's molding us and shaping us into the person that we're becoming. And the rabbi in our life has more significance than our circumstances, our habits, our rhythms, or what our best intentions. It's where we're going. I remember when Amy and I first started dating, and I was over in Victoria. We were living on the Lower Mainland, and it was one of the first times I was over there, and her dad came down. He said, "Hey, I'm going fishing tomorrow. Do you want to come?" And knowing this was potentially a new future father-in-law, and I was the new potentially future son-in-law, I thought this was a very significant moment that I should probably take. And because this police officer that never smiled at me for the last 6 months, I figured maybe we should go fishing. Hopefully he doesn't leave me in the ocean. So I've never really fished before. Like I did a little bit like on a river and I don't think I even caught anything. So I didn't have a lot of context, and we were going on the ocean. He had a boat, and it was quite further than I thought it would be. And I remember coming down in the morning, being ready to go. It's like in the middle of summer, it's 25 degrees out. I got like shorts and a t-shirt. He's like, go back and put on everything you own. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, you need more layers. I was like, okay. So I'm like, got everything I own. I'm wearing it all that I brought with me, and I'm going out on the boat, and I'm like sweating because it's 30 degrees out. But then we get on the boat, and we go out into the ocean, and there's this fog bank, and it's so cold. It's freezing. And he's like, I'm like, do you have anything else? He gives me a big jacket, and I'm just like freezing there. And I also had this understanding of fishing was you would actually do more fishing. Some of you would say the whole experience is fishing, but for me, fishing is like actually reeling something in. But a lot of the time in fishing, you actually don't do that. You just wait, or you set your bait, or you need to put new bait, or you need to go to a new area, or you just need to spend the next 20 minutes of talking about why you're not getting fish and your theories behind it. So I also remembered in this moment that I don't do well with motion sickness, and I've never really been on a boat, and the ocean does this a lot. And so I was feeling pretty queasy, and so he then asked me to do something that I was shocked. He said, do you want to steer the boat? I probably was green at that point, and he's like, you probably should stand at the front of the boat and maybe just steer the boat. And he's like, can you steer the boat? I'm like, I can. I'm accepted as your future son-in-law. So I went up, and I started steering the boat, and he told me, just keep it a straight line. I was like, okay. We're in the middle of the ocean. I don't know how to do that, but okay. And so then I'm like steering and having a good time, and like 10 minutes later, he's like, you're all over the place. I'm like, how can you tell? And he's got a little GPS, and I'm like clearly like going like this. And he's like, we got to keep it straight or our lines are going to tangle. We have not just one fishing line. We've like got several going on either side. I'm like, well, how do I do that? There's no road. There's no lines. Like, how do you keep a straight line? He's like, you find something in the horizon. You find an object, and then you look at that, and that becomes your direction. You don't look anywhere else. I was like, okay, which also helped with my motion sickness. And so I looked at that lighthouse. I didn't look at anything else because I had a father-in-law to impress, and I just kept that thing straight, looked down at the GPS thing, and kept it straight. That's like what your rabbi is in your life. It's the thing that you're looking at. It's the direction you're going. It's the thing that your target or your goal of your life is, and we all have something. And some of us, we are actually unsure of what that purpose is or what that target is for our life, and so we actually feeling like we're going back and forth in the storms of life, and we're all over the place. But it is significant to have a target, a direction that we're moving in our life, because when we experience the setbacks, when we experience the calamities of life, that we're always remembering where we're going to. Each and every one of us need to have a direction in their life, and the invitation that Jesus is offering you and I, and the invitation that Jesus offered those in the first century wasn't limited. It wasn't exclusive to just simply one aspect of your life, but it was exhaustive. It was wide-reaching. Listen to how Jesus speaks about it in Matthew verses 11 to 28. He gives this invitation. He says, speaking to a group of people, he says, come to me. Who? All of you that are weary. You're out in the sea of life and you don't have a direction. You don't know where you're going. You're feeling taken over by the storms of life. Those are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Now that word yoke is an agrarian term, and most of us didn't wake up and pick potatoes this morning, so we're not familiar with it. But a yoke was like this device you put on a couple oxen. If you've watched Pride and Prejudice, you maybe have seen it. Anyways, it would be over a couple oxen. It would help you plow. But the yoke was also an idiom for what rabbis would refer to their teaching. So in other words, Jesus is saying, take my yoke. Or this, in other words, this is how you shoulder the load. This is how you shoulder the load of life. In other words, Jesus is saying, hey, this is how you be human.
I'm giving a direction of what it looks like to be human. And this direction I give you, this yoke that you learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest with this. The direction I've set for you is one that creates rest for your souls. Souls, those things, that part of you that yearns, that's your soul. Jesus says, you're yearning, and I've got rest for that yearning, for my yoke, for the direction, for the teaching, for the way of life I have for you is easy, and my burden is light. Jesus' invitation to you and I is not just simply for the experiences on a Sunday or just a certain aspect of our spiritual life, but it is exhaustive. He speaks to every aspect of life, and he sets a direction for us. Even the term repentance that you hear often in churches literally means to turn direction. It's to rethink. In other words, when Jesus sees people, he says, repent. He says, your direction is, you're going a certain direction, and it's not creating the reality you want for you. But let me tell you about my yoke. Let me tell you about the direction for you in this way. And I promise it will be life that will create rest for your souls. Jesus gives the advice of how to be human. Timothy Keller, one of the great Christian thinkers of our time, in one of his books, he gives a whole detail of who Jesus is and outlines different aspects of him. And he concludes his whole section about Jesus. He concludes the whole section with this little paragraph that I think is helpful. He says this: Jesus comes to every individual and every culture and offers to fulfill their deepest desires and best aspirations. But in the same stroke, he also fundamentally challenges their beliefs and practices. He tells them that they've been going about seeking the fulfillment of those desires in profoundly what? The wrong ways. In other words, in the wrong direction. He offers them all they want: meaning, satisfaction, freedom, identity, hope, and justice. But he calls them to repent and seek their all in him. This is his basic message. Who's your rabbi? Who's an individual? What's the thing? What's the direction for your life? Because partly why we started this community is that we wanted to build a community around the teachings and the person of Jesus. For us, Jesus is our rabbi because we believe that when we structure our rhythms and our life around who Jesus is, it's the direction that is going to be the sweetest for us. It's the direction that's going to bring rest for our souls. It's our target. It's the goal that we're moving towards. So the first implication of Jesus being our rabbi is, one, it sets a direction for us, and secondly, it's a way of life, a way of life. How did Jesus teach? His teaching was less about him talking in a monologue, and it was more about the way that he lived. It was more about him instructing as he went. It was more of a way of life. See, it's interesting with his relationship with Levi. Levi did not call him and many others to listen to or obey his teaching. He didn't even call Levi to believe in him. He called him to follow him. In other words, Jesus called him to be a disciple, to do what he did, because that's what disciples did. See, a disciple of Jesus in the ancient world was not a passive term. To be a disciple of Jesus was not something that was passive. It was active. It was this verb. It was this function. It was this idea of following. And following is not something that you just simply stand and receive. Following is an active verb that you're moving. In other words, Jesus says to be a follower of Jesus, it's not a noun. It's not some status. It's not some profile status that you put on. It's not something that you just say, oh, I'm a follower of Jesus, or I'm a Christian. It would make no sense to those in the ancient world. To be called a follower of Jesus and a disciple of Jesus would mean that people are active in following him, that it would be a way of life. It would be a daily rhythm. Let me give you an illustration. In one breath, I could tell you that I'm a Canadian. I do very little to be a Canadian. My parents, when I moved here when I was very young, did some paperwork, and that's pretty much all we've done. Yeah, I live here. I pay taxes. But I don't think you even have to live here or pay taxes to be a Canadian. You might get in trouble with the latter one. You should pay your taxes. But there's very little that I do to be a Canadian. But I'm a Canadian. Some of you that are new citizens of Canada actually probably know way more about this country than I do. But let me tell you, I'm a Canadian, let me suggest that I'm a runner. Now, if I told you I was a runner, you would expect certain behaviors from me to be a runner. So I tell you, I'm a runner, and maybe you're a runner, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. Like, do you do like half marathons, or do you just jog or sprint, or what kind of running do you do? I'm like, oh, none of those. Well, when do you run? High school, crossing country would probably be the last time that I ran, and I hated it. That would be odd conversation for many different levels, but you would think, this guy is calling himself a runner, but he does nothing to be a runner. There's no action in his life. Running, to be a runner, is an active term, and there's no habits, there's no rhythms, there's nothing in his life to say that he is a runner. The same is true to be a follower of Jesus. In the ancient world, to be a follower of Jesus was an active term. James R. Edwards says it best in his commentary. He says, following is an act that involves risk and cost. It is something one does, not simply one thinks or believes. And in my experience, there has been so much confusion around this, especially in the Western evangelical world. So many individuals are confused a little bit about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Or they would classify themselves as a Christian, or they would have these adjectives or these profile settings around this. But to be a follower of Jesus was not simply about a one-time exchange. To be a follower of Jesus is not simply about uttering some sentiment of accepting God in your heart at one point of your life. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not diving into the legitimacy of salvation prayers and those moments and how people get to heaven. That's a conversation probably for Dave. We'll let Dave deal with that next week. Nor am I devaluing the profound significance of those moments. There are significant moments, and they're sincere, and those moments are significant of how we, like, there's lines that we cross, so there's significance of stressing these things. It would be like a wedding, right? A wedding is a significant moment that you get in front of your friends and your loved ones and before God, and you make commitments to another person. A wedding is a significant moment, but it's not what makes you married every day of your life. Maybe on paper, but if I told you I was married, but I never lived with my spouse, had no interactions with that, you would have some questions around that. See, to be a follower of Jesus means to continually count the cost. John Mark Comer, probably one of the best thinkers on this, he says it this way. He's like, following Jesus is more than a series of do's and don'ts. It is, but it's more than that. And many individuals think that's what following Jesus means. Here's what you do to be a follower of Jesus, here's what you don't do. But it's more than that. And he goes on, he says, and it's more than a list of ideas and beliefs. It is, but it's more than that. It's more than just simply having the right doctrine or the right beliefs about who God is or having the right statements. John Mark Comer says, following Jesus is more of a list of do's and don'ts and more than simply just having the right beliefs and ideas. It's a way of life. It's a way of life. The invitation that Jesus extends to you and I, him defining the relationship, is Jesus invites us into a way of life. Not just simply a status change. Not just simply an adjective that you call yourself. He invites you into a way of life. The implication for Jesus to be a rabbi means that it infuses into every part of your life. Amy and I both do the laundry in our house. Although I think in this season you probably do more than I. But we share the laundry responsibilities. And then when you get married, you realize that you've learned to do things differently. And Amy has these color coordination bins that change every week. It's so confusing. But one thing that I learned that my mom always showed me and that I always do is I check the pockets. Before I put that pair of Levi's in the washing machine, I check the pockets for like a phone, keys, money, but especially Kleenex. Because the Kleenex that's left in the pocket, it multiplies, it dissolves into 1 million pieces. And just 1 hour in that laundry machine, that Kleenex finds itself on every item of clothing in your entire load. It spreads. It doesn't just stay in your pocket. It gets out and moves everywhere. It's a mess. It just would be simply dissolved if we just checked the pockets before we put it in. That's the type of invitation Jesus invites us into. The way of life that Jesus invites us is just not one aspect, but it infuses into every aspect of your life and how you spend your time and your money, how you look at work and vocation, how you think about your body and your sexuality, what you think about what you do, how you talk to other people. Jesus' way of life is an invitation for you and I that's far more reaching than just simply one aspect. I'm inviting the team to come back, and I'm closing with this. See, actually, the term follower and disciple are probably not the best terms, because when you think of a follower, you think of like, I follow someone on Instagram, or I follow their LinkedIn account, or their Twitter account. Hopefully, I got most of the generations and areas there. Anyways, you follow people, right? It's sort of like this passive kind of this observation thing. And even to be called a disciple, if you grew up in Christianity or if you grew up in church, your idea of like discipleship or to be a disciple is like a Bible class or some lecture or some teachings, right? Probably a better word that scholars actually argue would probably be more accurate for the term in its ancient language is to be an apprentice of Jesus. See, apprentice for some fields is like if you're an electrician, you have to do a couple years of being an apprentice, which literally means you follow that senior electrician everywhere they go and do what they did. I remember when I lived in Africa, after I graduated that gap year, I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I went to Africa for just over about a year, and I did carpentry there, and I showed up, and I didn't really have a father that taught me a lot of those things, so I was very new at it. I was probably more of a hindrance than a help to them, but anyways, I showed up, and my first day, and they introduced me to Francis. And Francis became that person for me. He showed me everything about carpentry. The very first week, he gave me like that much of sandpaper. He's like, you use that till there's nothing left. So for a whole week, I just sanded everything by hand. And then they gave me what's called a belt sander. If you ever seen it, it's like this big thing. It's got this rolling like belt thing. Anyways, you put like sandpaper on that, and they gave that to me, and I was so excited. I went down to sand this door, and I like pulled the trigger, and it like took me like away. They took it back and gave me back the sandpaper for another week. They let me build like a cabinet, and they're like, after like several months, they're like, you're ready for this. And I like learned about angles, but I thought like if things weren't perfectly the same height or square, it wouldn't really matter until I put the doors on. And I don't know if some poor kid in Africa is using this cabinet. I don't know if it's still there. But the point is they were patient with me. The point is they took their time. They showed me little by little. They taught me the language. They called me a Mzungu. I was the only white person there, so everyone spoke Luganda, and I had to learn the language. I ate the rice and beans every day. I sat with them. I learned about their life. They learned about me, and they just gently brought me along. Each day showing me a new aspect, giving gentle correction when needed, showing me this is the way that we do this. Conversation, teaching moments of like, we don't weld without any safety gear on, Jordan. Let's go back and get your safety gear. In the same way, that's the invitation that Jesus has for you and I. To be apprentice with him. What would it look like for you to follow Jesus in your life? It means you just do the things that Jesus did. You do the things that Jesus did. You live your life in such a way that if Jesus were you, it's the way he would live it. It's an apprenticeship. It's this long journey. I'm still an apprentice of Jesus. 15 years in now, I mess up sometimes. I need him to show me different things. I'm still learning. I'm still trying to form my rhythms and my habits around him. But it just means that we just journey. We have a good direction. We have a good rabbi who brings us along and just says, listen, I want to talk about this area of your life. Listen, I think this rhythm could look different. Hey, I want to speak to the depth of your pain. I want to be a part of that with you. That's the invitation that Jesus has for you and I. I invite you to stand. I'm going to pray for you, and we're just going to move into time. I'm going to invite actually the prayer ministry team to come forward. I'm going to pray for you, but we're going to sing one more song, and there's going to be a few of us up at the front, and we just would love to pray for you. It's that simple. Because we think prayer changes things, and we think prayer is significant. And so maybe you're coming in with a burden or reality and no one else knows, or maybe you know, maybe peers know, but maybe you just want someone to agree with you in prayer. We have a team up here that would love to pray for you. So Father, I thank you. Father, I thank you for sending your Son, the great Rabbi, that's given us a model, a way of life, the way to be human, the way to live that we experience thriving, a way to live that we feel rest for our souls, the yearning that's deep inside us, we find rest in you. So Jesus, I just pray for every individual in this room, and I pray for those, firstly, that don't have any relationship with you. Maybe they've been curious, maybe they've been coming out each week, or maybe they're just on the sidelines, maybe it's their first Sunday. But a relationship with you can begin today. It begins just setting you as our direction. It's the beginning to just repent and say, I've been going about things all the wrong way. That in you, Jesus, is our deepest desires, our deepest aspirations, and it's about me course correcting in my life. Jesus, I welcome you to be my rabbi, to be the one who sets the path for me. And I pray for my brothers and sisters. May this be a reminder for what it means to be a follower of Jesus. It doesn't mean we vote a certain way, we do a certain thing. It means about our very way of life looks like His. That Jesus comes into every aspect of our life and He speaks, He draws a circle around and says, let's speak about this. You are the good rabbi, and may we be reminded today that in your direction you have, the path you have for us is one of fullness and life. So Jesus, you are sweeter, you are more beautiful than anything else. May our songs, may our moments today reflect that. In Jesus' name, amen.